welcome to this session on the recommendations for a national urbanization policy. This is a round table, and to start us off, I'm going to ask our CEO, Madhav, to say a few words about this project that we started working on last year with the EAC to the Prime Minister's office.
Thanks, Suresh. So the idea is to keep it informal. About I would say almost 18 months ago, our former CEO O.P. Agarwal went and met the Economic Advisory Council, and they suggested that can we think about a national urbanization policy, because there isn't one, and the whole question was what should be in a national policy, what should be not, etc. So since then we have been through a whole year process of doing consultations, talking to Mukta here, participated in some of the sessions. We did one in Delhi, one in Bangalore. From all of that, we got inputs and we started writing the policy, like putting together the recommendations for a national urbanization policy. And there were a few areas of struggle, about what should we include, what should we not, to what extent. So today's conversation is really to talk about some of these things that we struggled with and see if we can have a conversation around those topics. So presumably we've shared the policy with all of you. You've had you had the chance to have a look at it. We've also sort of spoken about. So really this purpose of this conversation is in a way, and of course we've submitted the recommendations to the EAC. There haven't been any further actions, so to speak. We've also shared it with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. We are also about to sort of make a publication around this and put it out in the public domain. But yeah, really would like to see if there are, to have this discussion and see if there is a way for us to also maybe think about creating then a joint platform to see how we can further advance this conversation. So that's really the purpose. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to Sudeshna.
Madhav already briefed us that we started working on this last May, and we had 4 mentors who were recommended to us by the EAC, and we were very keen to make it a sort of a consultative process. We also wanted to look at the existing policies and how they relate to urban, because we do not have a national urbanization policy. There had been attempts in the past, but they had remained as drafts. Just to create a bit of context, India at about 30% urban as per the last census actually has a low level of urbanization, but despite that, about 11% of the world's urban population actually live in India. And it is a very, very complex urban structure, from 20 million plus mega cities to towns of 3,000, 4,000, even 1,000 across the country. And the level of urbanization across states is also very, very different, as also districts within states. But given all that, urbanization is in a way inevitable, and once it's there, it's very difficult to reverse the process. And we are seeing that as we are urbanizing, there is a structural transformation that happens to the economy and society at large. At the Habitat 3 conference in Quito, the new urban agenda was launched, and the national urban policy was promoted as an important tool for governments to create an urban vision, as well as to provide some sort of comprehensive framing around how urban development should happen in cities of various scales and sizes, etc. Last year, UN Habitat, OECD, and UNOPS put out this global review of national urban policies of different countries, about I think 165 such countries. And it was, the patterns that emerged were very interesting. There were really about 5 core areas in which policies were being shaped within these urban policies. When we were asked to do this work, we were given a TOR by EAC, which had about 10 questions, and we mapped our questions onto these thematic areas. And also through the consultative process, we were asking what is relevant for India's urbanization. And we sort of came up with these 5 themes. The only deviation from the patterns that we saw in the other countries' NUPs, that here in India, and also it was one of our 5 of our TOR questions related to finance and governance of Indian cities. And so we included that as a core area to address in this, our recommendations for the NUP. And as Madhav mentioned, we are in the process of creating a WRI report based on the work that we did. And primarily, we are just asking 2 questions in this report. The first one, why is there a need for a national urbanization policy in India when urban development is a state subject? And the second question is that what are the key challenges from a cross-sectoral perspective for achieving equitable, prosperous, and sustainable urban development? So the first question, we have got enough, and we know that we don't really need to discuss it today. But the second question and the sub-themes under that, there are some wicked problems there which we are struggling with. And the purpose of this roundtable is to talk about some of those wicked problems. Now, the first one here is that the definition of urban in India really only categorizes urban and rural as these 2 very discrete categories. But we are seeing that most urban growth in India is happening in peri-urban areas outside municipal limits, and there is no planning structure, no governance, etc. Now, UN has come up with a new method, a standardized method for understanding, measuring, and defining urbanization across the world, called the degree of urbanization, which actually recognizes this missing middle of the peri-urban. And we ran that method for India. And what we found is that, and this is also a work in progress which we are going to put out very soon, that for the rural and the dense urban, it's fine. And this definition is basically based on population density and built environment density. But we are finding that most of the deviation from the census of 31% that the census talks about India's urbanization, and this is over 50%, close to 60, this is really happening in the suburban, peri-urban areas. And what do we do? So this is a wicked problem. Should a national urbanization policy talk about urban, peri-urban, and rural as 3 distinct categories? And if we do that, what are the pros and cons of making this recommendation? Another very big conundrum of India's urbanization are the census towns that get recognized, large villages that get recognized in every census. And in the last census, 3,000 plus census towns that got recognized, these are really the second biggest contributor to India's urbanization, but they still are governed under rural panchayat systems and without any planning. So, but in many cases, these census towns happen within the urban agglomerations, around large cities, also around other statutory towns, and sometimes they dispersed as market towns serving rural hinterlands. In this, that diagram over there, you'll see that this is our mapping of census towns in West Bengal. Most of it seems to be happening around the urban fringes of the Calcutta metropolitan area, and they house 11% of the urban population of Kolkata KMA and 20% of the built-up area of this area. But how do we really govern and plan these census towns? Do we do it at an aggregate level? Because it's very difficult to go into these small towns and give them planning structures and governance. So what should be the mechanism here? Linked to this is a case we picked up from Western Tamil Nadu. Our data analytics team did this, that you see these clusters of cities, these conurbations around larger cities, around larger census towns. The red dots in this left one are the census towns, but they also kind of develop as the city clusters around corridors, highways, etc. This is where the most population growth is happening in this region, and this is where most of the jobs are concentrated. But because there is no focus on regional planning, we also see a lot of negative externalities. There is exploitation, over-exploitation of water resources. There is acute air pollution, etc. So what do we do about these areas? So this brings us to this other problem of regional planning has been thought about in the 70s a lot. They were dropped in the 80s, 90s. Focus became on big cities and medium towns, cities as discrete entities, not the region. And there is currently really no proper institutional framework to also do regional planning in India. And the ones that exist, like the metropolitan and the district planning committees, are ineffective wherever they exist. So that was the other one. Now we come to the economic development. One of the biggest challenges of Indian cities is that we talk about the correlation between economic growth and urbanization. Most of the economic development in our cities is on the back of the informal economy. And these are typically low-paying jobs without much security. So, and then when you look at some of the states which are less urbanized, also score high on the multidimensional poverty like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. This is also the source states of migration, where the male workforce, the young male workforce migrate out. Now, the other challenge related to this is these are also the states which have, we talk about demographic dividend always in relation to India. We have this young workforce. Now, these are again the states which have the highest number of young people. Their median age is much lower than the southern states, for example, and they are also, like I said, the migration source states. Now, if cities are going to be enablers of human development, what can we propose to make economic development much more inclusive and also to reduce these inequalities that we see across these high urban, low urban states, etc., at different levels of development? And then finally, coming to climate resilience and environment, India is one of the most disaster-prone countries, but we have a plethora of tools right now available at the city level. And there seems to be some sort of a lack of convergence, because most of these plans, whether it's a climate action plan or a clean air plan or a heat plan, they are not statutory. They do not have any kind of legal mandate. It's the development plan that has that. So how do we seek convergence amongst these different kinds of plans? And then, as we know that environmental issues are trans-border issues, so you also have multiple jurisdictions that needs coordination to work on these wicked problems. How do we do that? How do we create these sort of interjurisdictional authorities to plan for disaster management and urban resilience? So with that, I would like to now get into the roundtable, and I'll ask my colleague Rajit to moderate the first round. And we are making a little bit of changes to this, and I've printed out the structure in front of you because there have been some dropouts. That we will like to keep the first round a little open-ended, wanting to hear your perspectives on what a national urbanization policy should be proposing. Thanks. Over to you, Rajit.
I will start an introduction round very briefly, because we had panelists we've invited, so I just wanted to mention that. Dr. O.P. Agarwal, who is also our former CEO. Thank you very much for coming, sir. And somebody, and the opening remarks, we'd like to hear from you also on the background of this NUP. We have Hyun Hee from UNICEF. Thank you for coming here. Dr. Champaka Rajagopal from Bangalore. Professor Kavis Kapadia. We also have Mr. Justin from Habitat for Humanity, Mukta Naik from the Center for Policy Research, and Parul from the UN Habitat. Thank you very much. As Sudeshna was presenting, we're really here today to rally towards a common vision for a national urbanization policy. We've seen how complicated our urbanization is and where we are on our urbanization trajectory. So we'll open it right up to our esteemed panelists. Start with you, Opisa.
Thanks, Rajit, and hello everyone. Pleasure to be here. Always delighted to be back at a WRI event in Connect Karo. As Madhav said, we did it last time many, many years ago. Delighted to be back. But coming to this, let me confess, I'm by background an electrical engineer. I did some work on transportation, somehow strayed into urban because government kept pushing me in that direction. So I'm not a person with formal qualifications in urban planning. So a lot of what I may say may seem offbeat, but sometimes offbeat can also be good. But a couple of questions come to my mind when I think about what an urbanization policy for India should look like. And I've always believed that a policy document is really an answer to certain questions that you have. The question that I have here is, if we are going to be 800 million people in 2050, as the UN projections seem to indicate, will those 800 million live in one city of 800 million people, or will they in 800 cities of 1 million each, or something in between? Obviously, it will be something in between, but what is the basis for that? And what a kind of a common sense approach has been telling me is 2 or 3 things. One, why do we have to look at only cities? Why not look at clusters of cities? This is what China is doing. They've developed 19 clusters. Now, the moment you go into clusters, you are also taking into account the captive area between those cities. You know, the point that Sudeshna made about peri-urban. It automatically comes in. Rather than just one city, can we look at clusters of cities? So if we look at Delhi, can we look at region around Delhi and not Delhi alone, not fix it to a boundary? That's one. Second is the other big gap that I think needs to come into a policy, a very big gap, is there is no linkage between our urban planning meant to be the engines of economic growth, as I hear in various statements. Where is the economic growth coming into urban planning? And I, for one, have, in a number of courses that I have been teaching also, have been arguing that when you want to develop a plan for a city, start with the SWOT analysis, which is absolutely fundamental. If you don't do a SWOT analysis, you've talked in thin air. Do a SWOT analysis, find out what is the economic driver for that city, look at that driver taking the city 10 times to what it is today, and then looking at what's the kind of infrastructure that you need to build, what policies you need to build, what else you need to do to help achieve that vision. So what is driving urban planning, or what I feel should be driving urban planning, is the economic driver for that city and the economic planning that needs to happen with that. I think that's the other thing that's coming up. The third point that I want to make is today is really a situation, you know, the Western world is talking about densities. In India, I feel we should also be looking at limits to this density. You know, the Western world is talking about densities because densities are low. In India, our densities are high. Are we reaching limits to that density? If we are looking to limits of that density, then should we not be thinking in terms of, you know, a lot of decentralized urbanization, rather than everyone moving to a Delhi or a Mumbai or a Bangalore? Can we think of decentralized urban for 2 reasons. One, today we are moving towards energy systems which will be decentralized. The moment you talk about renewable energy, it is much more decentralized. So that is one. Can we piggyback on that? Second, I think by moving too much to large cities, we have compromised on manufacturing. And manufacturing is going to be a very important part of our future growth. If that's going to happen, that should happen in the smaller cities. That's why some degree of decentralization is going to be important. Let me just leave it with these few thoughts. I think these are elements that can go into a policy document. But let me leave it.
Thank you, sir. We'll go to Hyun Hee next.
No, thank you so much, our WRI, Madhav and Sudeshna and Reggie for the invitation. I, like Dr. Agarwal, I'm not an expert. I'm just coming back 2 weeks ago from Gujarat, where we just had a Urban 20. For the first time, UNICEF, NIUA, and the Ministry of Housing Affairs, together with UN Women, were able to organize a side event that focuses on mainstreaming women, youth, and children into urban governance and planning process. So I wanted to focus on people in terms of situating them as a focus of the upcoming National Urban Policy. And the evidence and the science is very clear. One is that India is home to 460 million children under the age of 18. By 2030, you will have 60% of the urban settings will be occupied by children under 18. So when you design a city, if you were to design a city fit for children, it's a city fit for all. It's a city fit for young people, women. So I think we have to have our starting point there. And in this, we talk about demographic dividend. I would say demographic dividend and an opportunity, not a burden. So India has a huge opportunity with the National Urban Policy. And I wanted to focus on 2 areas. One is early years. We have so much science around brain development. 0 to 6, during the ages of 0 to 6, up to 90% of the brain is formulated. Every single second in the first 2 years of life or a few years of life, there's 10,000 neuron connections being made. It's a human capital development agenda by investing in the early years. Despite the science, we often do not think about the early years, even in the urban planning governance side. And this even came up, few G20 presidency as a key area, because a lot of G20 countries, if you see the high income countries, they invest 10 times more on early years in terms of social sector spending on health and education compared to low income countries and lower middle income countries. So that's one. And in terms of investing in the early years, I would talk about spatial planning frameworks that prioritize health, education, but also childcare infrastructure. So you know the clear links from childcare infrastructure. There's also a lot of evidence coming out where they talked about 43 million jobs globally generated by investing and providing childcare globally, and also $3 trillion per year global that could be added to the global economy if you were to create childcare infrastructure and family-friendly policies. If you see Norway, they did it over the 50 years, and over the 50 years, women's participation into labor force leapfrogged, as well as GDP grew 10 to 20%. I mean, these are evidence that exists, and I would say let's invest in childcare infrastructure. Second point I wanted to make is people. Let's involve people, and including children, young people, women, but also those from the most marginalized. Actually since I'm not an expert in this field, I asked my 12-year-old son before coming, and I said, what do you think a child-friendly city is? And he said, Mommy, where within 15, 20 minutes, I can ride a bike and go and buy something from the supermarket. Then I can go to school, and it's within 30 minutes, and I can have space. I have a park to play. So let's involve, listen to the voices of children. And I know that many partners, you already work on this anywhere, and UNICEF is trying to kind of replicate the model of Bal Sabas that we've started in rural villages, GP level. So it's in the statutory provision to actually involve them in the process. And then lastly, demographic dividend in the urban economy. I just wanted to mention it's very important that we focus on adolescent, especially girls, skilling, and youth employment in urban economies. And we often talk about just transition to digital economy, green economy, as well as care economy. These are the sectors that will provide huge growth potential for the young and the youth, and we need to ensure we support them and using cities as a hub. And in this process, I want to talk about social protection, because in the process of getting into these new sectors that are very new, people will lose jobs. There could have shocks from climate change. There will be vulnerability. We need to ensure that these social protection systems are available for them. And let me just conclude. I mean, at the U20, we released 3 compendiums. One on good practices of child-friendly cities across India as well as G20 countries. And then second is around urban social protection framework. And then third is around ensuring that children are part of the urban data framework. So let me just conclude. I will pass the mic to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoni. We'll go to Dr. Champakan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I completely echo the various recommendations made by my co-panelists. I have 4 things to share. I must first of all say that I'm an urban planner, and I'm sort of struggling to break out of my, disciplinary or professional imprisonment. So I've hoped to share some concepts and questions. I think OP sir brought about the importance of questions that we should be raising. So I have some responses to some crucial questions that WRI has put forth over here. I think the first and foremost requirement is more research and documentation. While we have international frameworks, there's also equally the need for responding to locally local challenges and locally driven solutions, endogenous innovations and solutions are critical. So there's very little data and documentation and knowledge that has been produced in the local context. So I think research and documentation is crucial over here. The second is about integrating economy, inclusion, environment, and spatial development. So here, I think we need to be looking at major transitions and shifts in value chains, because we need to transition from where we are today into a green economy. So that entire process requires us to actually plan and figure out a phase, sort of a strategy through which economies can transition into a green mode of production. I think that's the second most important thing. Then we'll simultaneously also look at integrating these with urban development phenomena. The third is about implementation. We have a lot of focus on planning. We often have practitioners as well as researchers speaking about how we have good policies, but they're not implemented. I think it's an iterative process. We need to look at what the ground demands and reflect that in our policies, plans, regulations, and procedures, etc. But we also need to focus a little bit more on what the science of implementation is, because implementation essentially often fails because we have a wide range of actors who are fundamentally misaligned in their values and goals. States, for example, are pursuing welfarist agendas, and private sector companies are pursuing profit-making agendas. So these are very different motivations. So one needs to, and there are, my colleagues in Azim Premji University, for instance, we've been working on implementation science, and there are specific methodologies that we can actually bring into government processes to enable better implementation. And here we need to look at some methods that come from game theory, actually not necessarily place theory, but also game theory, where we're looking at how collective incentives as well as individual incentives need to be fostered in our policy spaces. That's the third point. The fourth point, which is not spoken about enough, is the need to cultivate entrepreneurship, partnerships, and innovation. Entrepreneurship not in the way that business schools pursue, but entrepreneurship, if you go back 100 years, there's a lot of literature in applied microeconomics, for instance, where entrepreneurship has been discussed as being able to anticipate uncertainties and address risks in tangible ways. Of course, anticipating uncertainties doesn't seem like a very doable thing because it's an oxymoron there. But there are typologies of uncertainties that one can anticipate. And we need to cultivate this ability to anticipate uncertainties and deal with risks across multiple institutions, states, markets, societies, and other forms of hybrid governance systems that we all engage with in the processes of urbanization. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Champaka. Over to Professor Kapadia.
Thank you. Dr. Agarwal started with the confessions. I also have a confession to make. Unlike you, sir, I am a trained planner, practicing and teaching planning for 30 years. And I have to confess that I am still trying to understand what a city is. And the more I get into it, the more fascinating it becomes. Because with the kind of a complexity that we see, and especially in our part of the world, no wonder we have failed to get a grip on the situation. Now, the 3 points that Sudeshna asked us to pin down, I have roughly put them. These are not the only 3 points. There are, of course, hundreds of points. But in a descending order, I'll start from the point number 3 on my menu and then come up to point number 1, which actually encompasses all the 3 points. One thing that I find in this policy is that not enough emphasis has been given on water. And one of the biggest emerging problems, we are talking about green energy, we are talking about energy, we are talking about all forms of energy, but the crux of the whole thing, the water, where of course you have to do trans-regional planning and also national level planning, there is not enough emphasis given on that. And the seriousness of the availability of water in the times to come. What has happened, we have seen, we have polluted all our sources of water. When we see a nice, clean water body, we feel strange. I mean, when I see pictures of some places on earth where you can see the bottom, I sometimes ask a question to myself, does water look like this? All our ponds, all our rivers, they have been polluted beyond debate. So there is a very serious question hanging out there. Secondly, the question of city size. You know, traditionally, cities have grown by themselves. We don't even think how it works. We are so used to the chaos and the confusion that grows with a growing city that we take it for granted. And we forget that a city has a threshold, and that beyond a certain threshold, the quality of life begins to deteriorate. It has been recorded that as the city size grows more and more, the urban services and facilities which are given, they tend to deteriorate. Now, the question, very simply put, and I used to ask this to my students also, tell me, is a city of 20 million 20 times as complex as a city of 1 million? I mean, anybody would say that when a city reaches 20 million, it becomes infinitely complex situation. It is not a kind of a growth which is in proportion to the size. So I feel that while it is very interesting to show photographs of the Mumbai train, which is commuting 7 to 8 million people every day, why should it be 7 million? I mean, why should they travel the way they do travel? It says it's a matter of pride that, you know, the Mumbai trains transport 7 million people per day. It's mind-boggling. But why? I mean, the point is it not possible for us to limit ourselves? I know we are not living in China where we can stop entry at X million, but I really don't know what is that point of transition, where that point of inflection, where we would say that a city has grown enough and now let us concentrate on the periphery. I have recently written about it somewhere that during the COVID, when there was a mass exodus and people had to walk 1,000 kilometers to reach their hometown, why did they have to walk 1,000 kilometers? Why could they not walk 50 or 60 kilometers to reach their hometown? Because within 50 kilometers or 60 kilometers, there is nothing else. Our primate cities have grown so much at the expense of the periphery that we have got used to the fact that, you know, in a small town, when the boy becomes ab kamane ki umar ka ho gaya hai, to shahar jayega. It is understood that there is nothing in this place, so he will go to the nearest large city to earn his living. Now, this is the kind of a mindset that we have grown up with, because, and then we find that more than 50% of the population of mega cities is actually living in these so-called, town extensions, or you call them peri-growth or whatever. We have given them various names. The fact of the matter is they are all urban. They are all urban. I mean, the nitty-gritty of how we manage it is our problem. It's not their problem. So we have a situation where there are huge mega cities, and then there is nothing, and then there are cities which are middle order, lower order, left to their own. So I think this is one big problem. We have to apply our minds to the city size. And first and the most foremost, which covers all these three, is environment. Now, when I say environment, I mean that our cities have to be planned by some kind of an indexing based on the environmental issues, not on size, not on population, not on density. The environment itself will dictate everything else. And when I say environment-centric planning, not environment is also included in our city plan. There is a great difference. let environment become the guiding factor of what the city should be like, where it should go, what direction it should take, what should be the size and proportion of the city. I think these three are very highly connected, where it should take care of inclusivity, it should take care of safety, children, women, workforce, everything should be under the umbrella of environment predominantly, because we are already beginning to see that the writing is on the wall. I mean, we used to, when I was a student, we used to talk about, global warming is coming, it's coming, it's coming. So now we don't have to wait for it to come. We are right into it up to our noses. And this is the writing on the wall. And if we ignore it anymore, then everything else, in my opinion, is secondary. I think we have to be environmentally conscious. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We'll come to Mr. Justin. Yeah. We first do a round of our invited panelists and then we'll go beyond it.
Yeah. Hello. Good morning. Nice to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. Many of you know that Habitat for Humanity, name itself, we work on the affordable housing, the basic need for every human being. 2 days ago, I live in the bank of river Yamuna. So suddenly, it's called the Commonwealth Game Village. It's a posh village, of course. It's a high-end village. Suddenly, there was a news saying that all of you need to vacate. So we were thinking, where to go, whether to stay in the relative's house or to, book in a hotel. So many times we underestimate the poor people. They need housing. There's a basic need for every human being. I'm not going to statistics, 18 million plus in the urban million people need safe houses, barring the rural, even double the number. So a couple of things I just wanted to, over a period of time, we are able to build around repair, retrofitting, renovating nearly 9 lakh plus houses in the country. It's a lot of experience we are able to learn. So this policy document, I just wanted to give 2 or 3 thrust areas. One is for me, the most important thing is infrastructure financing. We work on the income pyramid, the bottom of the pyramid, the ultra poor. For those kind of people, only the grant model houses will work. If you look at the CSR funding, unfortunately, housing get only 6%. Education get the CSR funding is 22%. The housing, it's a very, very low priority because of the high capital intensive and the time taken to showcase. And also the impact to build one house, it will cost 5 lakh rupees. If you fund one school, you can impact 1,000 children. So obviously the CSR, they pick the education or livelihood, those projects. So housing, we get only 6%. So leaving alone the grant model houses, the middle layer, the loanable poor or the partnership model housing, it's one low-hanging fruit. We need to look at it. Many of you know that the Jaga mission has, it's one of the very progressive in the housing front. And once I met the principal secretary, Mr. Madhivadanan, he said, what civil society you people can do, if you can help 100 families, then you come back to me and talk to me, what you can do with this sector. So we are able to, when we look at it, the housing ecosystem, the gap or the challenging areas of housing financing. The PMAY, they are giving 2 lakh rupees, so that is coming in 4 installment. Unless you put 40,000 to start your house, then only the first installment they get. So many times, the first installment, the people do not have money to start with the house. That's a non-starter. Earlier, the government thought, we'll get 40,000, then people will, start constructing the house. And many people started using it for other purposes. And the government stopped that also. So without that 40,000 advance, there's a non-starter. You all know that PMAY, 12.3 million houses are started, but nearly only 6 crores are completed. Nearly 50% of there is unfinished houses. So I have the data from 2016, the first installment is given, people are unable to complete the houses. So what we have partnered with the Orissa government, just a best practices I just wanted to share, we are able to bring the private lending, in order to complete the house, you need 5 lakh rupees. The government is giving 2 lakh rupees. The remaining 3 lakh has to come from a private lending partners. So successfully we are able to get some of the lending partners and giving 3 lakh rupees And Habitat, we are able to bring the other three players, the public funding, private funding, and the people, their own sweat equity. That's a model. We are able to complete nearly 500 houses in last 1 year, and another 3,000 houses are on the in the pipeline. So unless this kind of a financing, these pieces are addressed, the affordable housing is going to be a big dream for many people. That is one. The other one, there is everybody is talking about climate change and the green housing. We are also taking some support from IFC and introduce the green design. Sir can help us out. SB at the students level, can we design the green design for the affordable housing sector? Of course, we are adding more solar into the houses, but the design itself, instead of using the clay bricks, can we use the fly ash bricks, low consumption of water and electricity. Minor tweaking can be done, and we can qualify these houses as to zero emission on carbon. The other one, I told you, I think Sudeshna and other people can look at the policy document, should talk about the power of partnership. Coalition and partnership is the way forward. Government alone cannot build, address the huge need. Because I am a housing guy, I talk about the housing shortage in the country. Unless you have a power of partnership, these issues not going to be solved. So can we have this, we call it a 3P model or a 4P model, private public partnerships. The 4P is one of the solutions I think the policy document should address. My final point is, convergence and partnership. I worked in a Delhi slum called, there was a fantastic model called Adas Basti concept. Many of us worked on that one. How do you improve the service within the slums? You have MCD, you have Jal board, there is a, electricity board. There are multiple, authorities, but can we bring them on a same board? There is a, Jal board doesn't want to work with the MCD workers. And convergence of multiple service providers in the slum. I think civil societies can play an important role to bring all the partnerships. So for me, infrastructure and financing, and power of partnership, and convergence of multiple service providers. These are the three takeaways. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin. We'll go to Mukta.
Thank you. Before I say anything, when I read the document, I have to congratulate the WRI team. Having been part of those initial conversations, can't imagine how much work has gone into not just putting the ideas together and doing the research, but actually proposing something which can change the language and change the thinking on urbanization. So I got goosebumps when I read it. So congratulations. So I have 3 ideas to push. First is we need to articulate in this document what we mean by these differentiated pathways for urbanization. I think it's very nebulous right now, and we can do a little bit more on articulating what this is. Is it about identifying economic functional typologies which draw on existing and potential economic activities, resources, environmental constraints, etc.? Is it about the position of the city in a multi-scalar hierarchy? Is it about, as OP sir said, density and categorizing cities, about the speed of the urbanization, like how long is it going to take for this city to reach X point, and so on and so forth. So what is this? Because I think states will need some more flesh and bones to really think about urbanization pathways. So I think that's something we can do. Second is, and this is because I work on this, but I think it's there and it's hidden, that we need to centrally recognize the role of internal migration in urbanization and structural transformation. It's hidden for good reasons, because we've had a very sedentarist imagination of growth in this country. It's fueled by the political importance of the rural in India, and it's linked to questions of the functioning of urban democratic structures, contentious issues around delimitation, and so on and so forth. But sidestepping all of that and building on how the COVID pandemic spotlighted this particular issue, I think the NUP can do more to push for migrant integration, especially for interstate migrants. And the third point, which in this particular sub-point, which is related later and we can elaborate, is on the specific creation of opportunities for interstate migrants in medium-sized town, and this is linked to the regional planning point, which we can, detail out later. So, and the third point that I wanted to really say, and I didn't see enough of, is that the NEP must not signal a top-down technocratic process. for rethinking our cities. It might be in the danger of doing that by not really talking about socially sensitive urban development, because, I mean, there has to be something about deepening democracy beyond the technical aspects of the 74th constitutional amendment. There has to be something about participative planning. It's sort of there, but not maybe fleshed out enough. And this point that both Champaka and Justin have made about the collaborative nature of urban governance, I think something we can flesh out. There's already a lot on complexity and networked governance that's out there, which Champaka and me have both sort of worked into our PhD work and so on and so forth, which we can pick language from and adapt to the Indian context. So those are the three top ideas. Differentiated pathways, what does that mean? Role of internal migration and socially sensitive urban planning.
Thank you, Mukta. I'll come to Parul.
Thanks. No, really good, interesting points. I would like to, just share some perspective on what are we trying to achieve through the urban policy. So I see this, that the need, moving away from whether we need it or not, but it can really help if we propose a robust and cascading framework of national urban policy. And given the context of India, where you have rightly mentioned the state subject, the role that the central government or the national level can play is to set this framework right. When I mean by robust, it means, again, drawing from the work that UN Habitat has done internationally, that a policy that is interspersed with acupuncture projects, and I'll share what that could mean in the context of India, with a very robust framework for monitoring and implementation. And here I see the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs can play a very important role by leveraging this policy framework as a planning instrument to design their missions. Something that we have all experienced or we know about, and the ministry is also aware, is the siloed approach to the missions, and often the convergence of those missions occurs on ground. So can this framework for policy, when it is designed, allow for that integrated approach right at the central level, where missions are designed in a way that they inform those acupuncture projects? And given the context of India, and we're talking about 7,000 plus cities, national missions which look at 500 cities are, in my, I would, if I can be a bit more provocative here, are really pilot acupuncture projects in the context of India. So can the missions do this right? The second, in terms of the cascading effects, I think this is again important to set the vision right, which the states can then take up and develop very solid urban policies that are contextual to their territories. Second point that I would like to touch upon is the vision. So what is the vision? And I think that is where it has to be a democratic process. But if I can push the boundary and say, if we're aspiring for a balanced and decentralized and equitable planning vision for the future, then just again a provocative question, can we really engineer a system of cities? So globally, countries, regions that have tried to build a new city, there are more examples where such interventions have failed than succeeded. So can we, again, going back to what you were saying, Champaka, we need very clear understanding of how our cities are growing, organically, because there is some logic to where people are concentrating, why they're concentrating. Perhaps you're not studying it enough. What is the economic geography of that concentration? Industries are coming in. Obviously, there has to be some sort of understanding. We do not invest enough in understanding that. And I'm so glad that now we're talking about this economic geography, which has been decoupled in India. We do not try to interlink planning and economy as we should be, as other countries that have grown, and they have grown rapidly. We use the term rapid urbanization in the context of India, but honestly, we are not rapid. And it's at 4%, it is not rapid urbanization, we are just growing at a very slow pace. So really, what does that mean? And so what does that system of city look like, and what purpose does it serve? So if I can draw from my own experience, and I'm sure all of us would have different experience, and I go back to my age cohorts. In my 20s, I wanted to go to that big city, not because that's where the jobs were, but that's where the energy was. Cities were more vibrant. But then, and I, like 2 decades later, I find myself more attracted to a Bhopal or a smaller city, with various needs. So we need to, just to making a joke, but there is also a very important economic reason why cities grow and why certain cities are intermediary cities. And that's the reason for where we talk about, if I can use some language of agglomerations. There are generalizations in agglomeration cities like New York and these large pockets in Delhi, Mumbai, where we see a number of economic sectors concentrating in one area. They come up with new innovations, ideas. There is interaction between these. Some new model of industrial production is developed, which then moves to an intermediary city for scaling up, which is where it is rightly placed also. You cannot have the economies of scale, of labor, all the markets, all the forces of development function better productively in a large city. They have to move to an intermediary city. So we really need to understand that economic geography, concentration of densities. Too much density, we cannot, I think to dismiss it as wrong might be being too dismissive early on. So perhaps different densities serve different purpose, different demographic profiles. So cities serve different demographic profiles, and we need that type of diversity in our system of cities. And I would really, push, understanding what that is, bringing in the academic literature of political economy of cities. There's just so much research being done that is not being adequately incorporated when these policy and program decisions are being made. So I would think that through WRI's work and the recommendations that are being sent to the EAC, perhaps these are some points that can be brought to the attention.
Thank you very much, Parul. We've had a great first round. OP really talking about the cluster of cities, size of cities, how do we look at some of those aspects. He spoke about the focus on people and children because of the demographic dividends we have coming up. Champaka spoke about the importance of research and documentation in a context like ours and other aspects like entrepreneurship and implementation. Professor Kapadia on the water crisis really coming up on us and environmental centric planning. Justin spoke about housing, infrastructure, finance, critical areas. Mukta spoke about how do we explain further on differentiated pathways for urbanization, looking at migration and deepening democracy. And Parul concluded that with the cascading framework being a right way to move forward. And of course, understanding our economic geographies of our cities. I'll hand over to Sudeshna to take the next round. Yeah.
I think, Madhav, you want to say something?
Just one, again, request, I think. I think what Mukta talked, one of the things we thought would be useful at least to put is this differentiated pathway system of cities, because you saw the middle is so big and there is really nothing that talks about that middle. So, and I think, again, from our conversation of what should be in a national policy, that seemed to be something. So, what is that, what kind of structure, or if there is any work around thinking about that, that was, I think, one of the, of course, I think governance, finance, I think were all important. And again, that's actually not super our area of expertise. So, if we do that, we need more help around that. The second thing that we struggled, right, and because from where we come also, this whole bringing the environment aspect in, and again making sure that you're not sort of telling states to do something. What is how does it sit, right? Is it do you even provide a framework? Do you highlight it? Is it recommendatory? One of the things that I had asked, we had talked about is, we had also, if you see, there are verbs we have tried to use, right? And that's also to sort of reflect sort of the federalism and all of that. So again, what is in the national urban policy and what is just a recommendation? I think that is also something. So I think several points are good recommendations, but do they even need to be in the policy or can go in the annex? And I think this was the big struggle. And then if you want to recommend 5 things, because when we went to meet the secretary also, it was like, what are your 5 recommendations? Right? And we were sort of struggling with it because we had 2 or 3. But I think this is exactly the kind of things they are also dealing with. So if we can sort of reflect on this as we go forward, that will be very useful.
Thanks, Madhav. In this second round, there's so many excellent points that each of you made. I think what we should do is will give you an opportunity to elaborate on some of the points that you made, and if you can relate it to any of our wicked problems, that will be excellent. So maybe this time we go from this side. Parul, I know you spoke last, but if you would like to elaborate from UN Habitat's global experience of working on national urban policies and looking at the urban crisis that we have in India, what should be 2 to 3 key recommendations that we should focus on?
Thanks, Sudeshna. I think your presentation already covered the 5 thematic areas. I think there is no, and we see the common ground already from the different panelists, that climate change, environmental sustainability, and the planetary boundaries is something that is common, that is most important for us, and that is something that is, that is mainstream, or that's a common thread across whatever the size of the city, whatever neighborhood pocket we are talking about. So every investment has to be climate resilient, has to account for, to create less damage to the way we build. So emphasis at the national level, I think it is important, because we see from the way the missions are implemented that even though it's most of the urban sector is a state subject, the national missions or the national policies matter. The cities and the state governments do look at those model policies, legislations, guidelines, which are then refined and polished to set their local context. So I think it's important that this national urban policy framework also articulates what those key principles should be, and then which are then left to the state to add on to with their context. The question here on what do we do with the peri-urban areas, this missing middle, and here my reflection is that we already have a system set up through the 74th Amendment of having metropolitan planning committees. Why not strengthen those? Why not empower those? It's important. It's already a constitutional mandate. We need to push the states to actually adopt it. And change whatever the regulatory, statutory changes that need to be done, because wherever states have established those structures, we see the level of participation and engagement has been better. It has been more inclusive. So I would again reinforce that, instead of reinventing the wheel, instead of questioning this. And I feel like that is what is important, because if we create another category of peri-urban, we are further making this challenge more granular, more segregated, whereas it takes us away from the spirit of that integration. So I would, that would be my one thought, that we should really reinforce the idea of metropolitan planning, which should occur within the subset of your jurisdiction, ULB level, because, again, being very practical, that there are certain urban services which would be limited to the ULB's boundaries, but whereas others, where be it garbage collection, which could cross those jurisdictional boundaries for leveraging the economies of scale. And I have not done in-depth research on what are the current challenges or lacunae in the MPC in the way that is set up. But at least from the experience of the last several years, I think that's something that should be taken up and refined if needed. Climate action, I'm sure there's a lot of study, but I'm going to speak personally about this economic development bit, because that's also something that I'm more passionate about and have a bit of an expertise in. So I think we really need to study the economic geography of cities, which is not done. I mean, in most of the discussions with the decision makers, policy makers, a lot of this, I think there is a disconnect in really understanding the power of planning, zoning codes, bylaws, and how that can really influence a city's economy. It's just not just about setting up another trade hub or free trade zone or an industrial hub. There is a lot more complexities to it. In the context of India, we have a large informal economy. We really need to understand that, perhaps not apply more very conventional economic models or methods to understand it. There are very fast methods of understanding the value chains, studying a specific economic cluster, understanding how that is, and these are quick fixes that, if with the right leadership, with the right political will, these clusters, these informal clusters, can be made more productive. Be it your auto parts, or there's just so much potential that is not being leveraged just because of the gap in understanding this. And my point for that would be if we can collectively push the government to invest some more time in understanding this rather than looking for those transformations in the next month, which is their demand that we, make that project, show us something on ground. But there is value in putting in some time and effort into understanding how this economic clustering is happening, and then building the capacity of the planners of our development plans into formalizing it. I think that's where this informal economy can be formalized through a common language of planning, development, infrastructure. That can be brought in, and the policy, I think, could be the place where this system or this framework can be articulated on how the city level or the state level development, sort of a toolkit or a guide can be prepared as a guidance note. Yeah.
Thanks, Parul. Mukta, so could you elaborate a little bit on the differentiated pathways that you are asking us to elaborate on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a longer conversation. It's probably a little bit nebulous. I did articulate a few ideas before on whether we're talking about economic functionality or typologies, are we talking about stage of urbanization? So just related to that and picking up from Parul on this peri-urban issue, because clearly clustering, peri-urban, census towns in those clusters, I mean this middle stuff that Madhav indicated is the mess that we are all really grappling with. So on that, I think, the nature of these spaces will change. So prima facie, it's a great idea to categorize them as peri-urban, but are we saying that the normative direction is to become urban? Like what's the idea here? I think there will be that question lurking around if you make a three-tier classification. Here, I think early recognition of land transformations and capital investments in non-farm uses, whether they are manufacturing, we already know manufacturing is outside the city, sitting in these spaces, retail, warehousing, housing itself, plotting agricultural land. So we know this is happening. Most larger cities kind of know this is happening in their periphery, but picking on the sort of using all the technologies we have to recognize this, governance mechanisms to engage with local capitalists who will resist this formal urbanization because it means more regulation and more costs. So this is the wicked problem. Like you can't go in and say, I'm going to plan and I'm going to make it municipal because there will be local pushback. So this is a political economy issue that the NUP has to recognize and say that, the center can provide incentives in terms of giving whatever, some money or whatever for the infrastructure or the investment part of it. But states will have to invest in this negotiation and this sort of setting up of whatever powers you need. So we will need to look up at municipal autonomy and regional coordination to do this, because this is the sticky part of it. Land reservations for affordable housing, ecological infrastructure, these are mistakes big cities made. We shouldn't be making them in these clusters, which are currently peri-urban, may have land and may have space to do some of these things. And if we don't address it now, 10 years later, we'll be saying, now we don't have this land. How do we get it back from, and even if we get it back, it's brownfield, it's polluted, we'll be stepping into these issues. So this is also, applies to census towns as well. So related to this is the question of the use of medium-sized towns as a strategy for balanced regional development, similar kind of issues. Economic geography, where are people, are they commuting? Is there enough incentive for these young people to move into these cities? Why not? Why are they commuting? Yeah, we know it's because it's better rural highways, so it's easier for them to commute, but is that the urbanization we want? Where we have hundreds and hundreds of bikes coming into medium-sized cities instead of actually creating places for them to stay, because again, we're replicating the mistakes of the large city in terms of high capital, very, we're already, the affordable housing is not even a possibility in a medium-sized town. So if we go further down the hierarchy of urbanization, I think we need to understand what are the mistakes that were made and at what size of city are we where we can actually preempt some of those mistakes. So in that sense, actually typify places where interventions of certain kinds are still possible, places where we now have to think, like in your NUP, you've already said, about reuse and sort of renewal and redevelopment kind of ideas, because well, the mistakes have been made, and now you have to shift incentives entirely, and maybe have a totally different conversation about climate impacts and resilience and those kind of things, because people there are already suffering, which sort of links me back to this disconnect of people with their cities. So what really bothers me is a lot of urban residents saying, we live in terrible cities, and really being frustrated about the inability to contribute to that conversation. And we need the buy-in. If large cities or larger cities which are already problematic need to substantively shift their urbanization pathways, you need the buy-in of people who are already there and who've made large capital investments in housing and business, etc., and are kind of locked in to those places. And their opinions or their frustrations are really not being taken on board in this technocratic process. So I know it's a scattered set of thoughts, but it's sort of speaking to specific areas in the NUP as you've outlined right now.
Just wanted to pick up, what I said from, the entire value chain in the affordable housing sector. Starting from many of the middle sector or the low cost lower income group. First of all, they don't have any design. There is no cash flow and budget. Entire nascent training and coordination with the government. So we have almost 12 services we offer under HSS, Housing Support Services. I strongly recommend, unless the government, there is it's part of the PMAY or any government program, Housing Support Services should be part of our recommendation that I want. And also, I mentioned earlier, this entire, the value chain, the major non-starter or the challenging areas, the gap funding. We need to promote some sort of a consortium of private lending partners. I know we have been dealing with Aditya Birla Group, Swadandra Micro Housing. That's only one private lending, socially conscious private lending institutions are not unwilling to come to the informal sector. How do we help these lending institutions to do the ease of business? There are many people, there are a lot of organizations are willing to come, like Awas Housing, small banks like ESOP. But we need to bring those kind of a lending institutions, socially conscious lending institutions should be part of the financial mechanism. In the slum, we all know that nearly 1 lakh slums are notified slums. The people are going to live in there for many years. Is there any solution we can offer, home improvement solution to the people who are living in the slums? It can be a grant model or a loan model. How do you bring that? And my final point is, in the spatial planning or any housing program, what is the space for technical experts or government is slightly allergic to the civil society, but you can call it as a technical partners unless there is a partnership space for all of us. Then only we can reach out to the people, in millions of people who need housing in the country. Thank you.
Taking off from where Parul has also pointed out certain necessities, certain essentials why the large cities grow and why the large cities pass on certain functions to the smaller cities surrounding it nearby. I feel that these ideas of participatory planning, of informal economy, they all need to be taken seriously and cultivated in a smaller city, where they do not need a necessity, they do not feel a necessity to fit themselves as a service industry to a larger city, but they can grow at their own pace and at their own convenience. When we say that 74th Amendment had given certain rights to the local municipal corporations to do the business of planning, we find that has not really taken off in the true sense. And so much so that there are many municipalities we know in India which do not even recognize city planning as a profession, and planners find it very difficult to find a lucrative job as such. So what to talk about the planner's opinion as far as the professional opinion is concerned. So I think there is a need to actually accept the small town as an entity and work towards it as a place which is of course not compatible with any of the metro cities in terms of economic base, but in itself create something which is environmentally sustainable and desirable for a better quality of life people in the small town do not expect to have a life which is as glamorous as that we find in a large city. They are very contented, they are very happy. And this contentment and happiness has to be converted into an economic well-being situation by certain appropriate policies, which will make some kind of an attractive invitation for people to not leave these towns and gravitate towards the larger cities. Now this is a very complex situation. It's not easy to achieve because one of the reasons why small towns do not sustain themselves is the push factor, because of course there is the glitz and glamour of the large city. We all accept that. But my question is, to what extent is that feasible? I mean, can we not say that enough is enough at a certain point, and what is that certain point? So there is a lot of scope for doing some kind of a research on that, because if we do not do that, then we end up with Delhi and Mumbai, which have, in fact in Mumbai I was just considering that if you are travelling from the fort area to Andheri, you are actually crossing about 30 fully grown towns. I mean, it's just that you are not aware of the fact that you have crossed almost 30 complete towns. Today when we talk about Nalanda and our traditional cities, we forget that the scale of the problem is so complex that Ambala is a city which is equal to Daryaganj. So, the size makes certain amount of complexities which we get embroiled with, and it creates all sorts of problems. So, when I said environment has to be the guiding factor, I really mean that smaller cities, good environment, good living conditions, quality of life, and there is a lot which remains to be done in this field.
In fact, I completely echo Mukta's compliments to you about this fantastic document that you've shared. It was really brilliant to go through every single point you've highlighted, and you've created a very robust framework within which you've made very strong recommendations, and contextual as well as locally relevant as well as nationally significant points that you've highlighted. And these are points that we've not typically been discussing in the area of urbanization so far. So I think they're absolutely brilliant. I have in fact, I have very specific responses to the 3 questions that you had mentioned, so I'd be happy to share this document later by email. But quickly, just to also sort of respond to what points everyone's been bringing up, the point about census towns and also this rural to urban governance transitions is one aspect that I've elaborated on in quite a bit of depth in my recommendations, which I'll share later. But the big point that I made is about pursuing multiple disaggregated pathways. I haven't framed it in the same terminologies that Mukta has, but that's precisely what I've recommended. My recommendation also stems from a recent intervention that was made in the government of Karnataka, where Mr. Atik, who is Principal Secretary Rural Development, had made a proposal for transitioning gram panchayats, which should ideally be recognized as nagar panchayats, that there is a phased transition mechanism which has been proposed by the Department of Rural Development. But this particular recommendation has been lying dormant because of resistance to shifting of power relationships, and it's fundamentally rooted in shifting of power structures. So my recommendation is to actually propose some sort of a national level program to garner multiple pathways to transitioning, and Nagar Panchayats themselves are the governance mechanism through which new power, new arrangements that are akin to city governance, urban governance, can get institutionalized. But these solutions need to come in disaggregated ways from local context. So my recommendation here is to actually launch a national level program, which can then solicit inputs from gram panchayats, which should ideally be transitioning into a Nagar Panchayat status. The second is about, the broader context of the 74th Amendment. I personally think it's fallacy for us to expect that these decentralized governance arrangements are all going to work out even in due course of time in the next 10 years or so. So in lieu of, while we're awaiting all of those reforms to take place, it's important to explore agile institutional arrangements which can still emulate the DPC-MPC arrangement. We can have organizations set up and dissolve them, because the question here is again power relationships and political resistance to devolution of power. So I think agile institutional arrangements is a recommendation that I had. The third is about the importance of partnerships. I'd come back to Justin's point. I think they're crucial. My own work deals with partnerships, multiple forms of partnerships. I'd like to highlight a caveat here that partnerships that we're speaking about, whether it's for basic services or for housing or affordable housing or for any other cross-political boundary arrangements in terms of large infrastructure projects. A key pressing problem that persists is that these are long-term contracts. As long-term contracts, they produce the problem of residual control rights, because there are moments in contractual arrangements where where contractual agreements do not exist, because human beings are fundamentally incapable of drafting, of anticipating the future to a great level of precision and defining contractual agreements in complete ways. So fundamentally, all contractual agreements are incomplete. So they produce the problem of residual control rights, where actors then behave in self-interest as opposed to public interest. So it's critical to actually evolve innovations in contract implementation, where over-the-counter contracts, for instance, so other kinds, I'm speaking very practically over here, where we need to think about other kinds of arrangements which are built within these long-term partnership arrangements, so that because these residual control rights, for instance, produce other kinds of disputes, cost escalations on projects. These are then waived off as large loans to corporate sector entities, for instance, which don't really come out that much in the public domain. But these are pressing problems in terms of public finance and risks, financial risks that are then transferred back onto the state and to the public. So I wanted to just close with the importance of contracts. I had one conversation with Madhav, in fact, on this several years ago. And I do recall a piece that he had authored, so I'm sure it's also WRI's imperative to focus on contracts. It's a highly underrated, under-focused area. Basic services are all hinged on effective implementation of contracts. The literature on state capacity, for instance, is also focuses on the need for effective implementation of contracts.
I would like to conclude with the fact that we won't be able to achieve the SDGs if we don't address the vulnerabilities in urban settings. So I wanted to pick up on Justin's point about informal settlements in slums and looking at the most marginalized. So as UNICEF, we have been looking at the zero-dose cases. So these are children who have not received one single vaccination, immunization. And this has actually worsened. The routine immunization cases have actually worsened after COVID, or it was already very bad, but we just had, we came to attention around the urgency. And we estimate globally about 300 million to 500 million people that will be in informal settlements as well as slums. And many will be in countries like in India, and this is something that we need to maybe consider putting a spotlight on. Second is we have an opportunity in the Urban 20, as I mentioned, for the first time they had actually have references to participatory governance, urban governance, talking about the rights and the ideas, hearing the voices of women, youth, and children. So let's pick up on this and make a strong emphasis. I think many speakers have already touched upon the importance of hearing the community's voices, children, young people, and women. So I think it should be a core. So I would say not only for people, nature and climate, but with people as well as a framing. Second is, therefore, the spatial planning framework should look at the human development agenda, as I mentioned, the education, health, as well as you rightly mentioned, water and sanitation, which is so critical in cities in terms of even environmental sustainability. And I would really emphasize, although I mentioned 3 economies that we're entering into, new economies: digital economy, green economy, and care economy. For digital economy and green economy, there's been a lot of conversations and probably a lot of financing is going into it. Care economy is a sector where there's clear dividends. I would say triple dividends. Not only child development outcomes improve, health and education for human development, capital development, but also women go back to work. So your women's workforce participation increases, enhances, and we know there's multiple effects, even mental health issues for women. So I think it's a clear case that cities could prioritize when we do the infrastructure and the planning around care infrastructure. So I won't mention all of the evidence that I already cited, but it's something that if we could clearly put into the urban policy, that would actually generate the most highest return, I would say, among all of the 3 sectors that I mentioned. Thank you.
One advantage of this is you don't have much to say after all that. But let me pick, I think some very interesting points were being made, and I'll pick on just 1 or 2 of them. One is this whole issue of large cities versus small cities. I mean, that came across on most of the comments that have been made. And when I just think to myself, I said, what exactly is a city getting by defining itself as a city? You have a municipal corporation. What is the municipal corporation giving you? It's giving you water supply, it's giving you solid waste management, it's giving you street cleaning, street lights. It's not giving you an airport, it's not giving you the metro, it's not. So if people need services, a lot of these services are not immediately for one city. It is for a much larger jurisdiction than just a city. The municipal corporation is not giving you economic activities. These are again a lot more regional. So should we be locked into the idea of a city which has a municipal corporation? I mean, let's sort of think fundamentally on this. The cities and the municipal corporations are not giving you electricity. In many states, they're not even giving you water. They're all state-level bodies, and whatever historical reason they may be. So the reason I'm bringing it all in is I would still argue for looking much more regional. Look at clusters of cities, look at regionals. And I remember one of the discussions I was having with Madhav when we started on this work at an early stage, actually more the economic geography work. And the question I asked him is, what would you like to see at the end of this report? If we give it to the government, what action of the government would you think would tell you that this has been a success? And he gave me a very simple answer, which I thought was brilliant. He said, if Mr. Hardeep Puri can announce that we will now go and have regional economic development plans prepared for 20 different parts in the country and plan for urbanization with those economic development plans, regional plans, he says that would be success. I felt that was brilliant. So take it from there. Why get locked into an old philosophy of a city with a certain definition to have a body that will give you a limited set of services? Why not think bigger? The second thing is, when you look at these services themselves, they actually fall into different, there are different economies of scale for all these services. An airport, you can't have an airport for a small town. The airport has a certain economies of scale. A university has a certain economy of scale. So can we look at these services according to these economies of scale and create institutions, one at a regional level very definitely, which would provide these services and let the boundary be of that region. Now, Paris is 1,256 cities. I didn't know this. But Paris is actually a region with so many cities, and a small mohalla there is a city. The mayor of that city provides certain sets of services. The region provides certain other sets of services. We are not doing that in India. So I think what better than a policy document coming out from India highlighting this, from WRI India highlighting this. This is one. The other thing I would pick up on Justin's point, I think Justin touched on something which is very important on financing. And financing infrastructure in India, I'm not referring to CSR money and all that. That's less than half a drop in the ocean. I'm talking of why are we thinking of the public budget paying for most of this infrastructure? Why are we not looking at a much better involvement of the private sector into providing this infrastructure, this support? It can't come out of the public budget. The Ishar Aduwalia committee projected 37 lakh crores. McKinsey has projected some $3 trillion or some number of that sort. Whereas the Smart Cities mission was only 1 lakh crores over 5 years. The numbers of the public budget can support are minuscule. So we really need to think much more in terms of how we leverage the capital markets, how we develop projects which are bankable, build capacities for them, and wherever it's not bankable, use the public budget only for that. And one important thing is don't do projects that are needlessly expensive and not giving you the outcomes that you're looking for. We're investing far too much in some of these projects which are really not giving us the outcomes we're looking for. So let me leave it at that, but I think brilliant points that you brought.
Thanks to all our panelists and all those who are in the room. And I think it has been just such an exciting session. We'll be in touch with many of you, most of you, if not all of you, as we go forward in sort of wrapping this up. Some of you have seen it before, some of you may saw it for the first time. So we'd love all your inputs. We'll be recording this, and if we have any questions, we are going to come back to you. But thanks again so much for joining us today.